So do you think monarchy is the appropriate system of government for Christian men?
Well, firstly, we have to understand that we are living in this fallen world preceding the second coming of Christ. So nothing that will happen now until the second coming of Christ will be the right thing. The only thing that we can have this side of the second coming that is the right thing is the true communion in the true church. Everything else is tainted by our human nature, our sinful nature, our making mistakes, our rebellion. And all of that is in a process of theosis. And no matter how far you are up the ladder of theosis, if you are this side of the second coming, you will fail on some level and will be in need of God's forgiveness and God's mercy. So it's almost futile to try and say what is the best system for a Christian man this side of the second coming, short of go to church, confess your sins, partake of communion, love your wife, love your neighbor, pray for forgiveness, pray for mercy. Because anything that we're going to cook up, even if we have a miraculous restoration of the Byzantine Empire with a global Orthodox emperor, it will fail because it's this side of the second coming. And I think that's also partly why God has even allowed these things to either just outright fail or to become as diluted as the British monarchy has become. Now, having said that, I will say that the perfect form of government is obviously a monarchy, but it is a monarchy with Christ as the king, not a person. And that's how it was in the Old Testament, just after Joshua had taken the promised land and the Israelites were running their own little part of the world there in Canaan, and God was their king. And then they started doubting in their humanity, feeling that the surrounding kingdoms had kings and were amassing armies. And then they went to Samuel. Was it Samuel? They went to the prophet. I think it was Samuel at the time. And they said, look, we want a king like the other nations around us. And then God's response there, you can go look it up in the Bible, was, oh, am I not your king? And is that not enough? And then God said, well, if you insist on having a king, you will have one. But then you will have to accept the fact that he will tax you. He will take your sons to fight in wars. And even there, it shows you the failing aspect of humanity. Because even if you have a godly king on earth, he will still tax you and he will still take your sons to go to war. And that taxing and the going to war has to do with our sin nature. We need to protect ourselves, we need to fight, we need to kill, we need to, we need to prop ourselves up with roads and logistics that need tax because we are fallen, we are sick, and we need God's restoration. And that restoration will only fully come when Christ comes back and he is our king. And then there is no need for war and there is no need for, tax and things like that. So, yeah, but right at the beginning, God was even like, oh, am I not enough? Now you want a king like everybody else. So, yeah, there is no perfect system this time. Yes, that doesn't mean we sit back and do nothing. We still try and do what we can. We still try and work together. We still try and, keep things going as we should. So,
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, obviously, it'll never be perfect. It will always fall and it will never actually work. But what we saw, for example, in the Byzantine Empire, to a certain degree, was people pursuing a standard. Probably themselves
yes.
recognizing that this was temporary. It's going to fall at some point. I mean, all of human history will show that it will always ebb and flow. Right?
Yeah.
And so, that being said, obviously, as our base standard, we want to be able to attend church. We want to be able to take communion. And let's assume we've got those two things down, which in the West we we mostly do. Obviously, in Soviet Russia, it was a different story. You're talking up to 20 million Orthodox Christians were killed under Stalinist rule.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
At least in the West, we at least still have that liberty. And it's like, okay, saying that now that we have that, is it better to continue pursuing the higher standard and look to build a Christian monarchy, or does one just then focus on the church, focus on the church life, and whatever happens outside the church doors, then let it happen, you know?
Well, look, you have to pray for what happens outside the church. You have to obviously try and help and do what you can, feed the poor, take care of the orphans, have hospitals, things like that. But I don't think it's a good thing to just be kind of like, oh, well, that's their problem as long as we've got everything sorted in church. Obviously, we must do everything we can. We focus on the basics, and that includes not just communion, going to church. It's also got to do with, running an ethical business, doing your work, loving your wife, raising your children, things like that. But getting involved in the humanitarian stuff, orphanages, hospitals, raising those things up, visiting prisoners, things like that. And I think then around that, if you have small communities of that happening, and if those communities grow large enough, then each community in its own right can then start thinking about, okay, what are we going to do now? We are becoming bigger and bigger. That's how it was in history. I mean, initially, for instance, the Bulgarians, when they became Christian, they had that situation where they had to establish a state. Now, in those days, you could still establish a state. It's not as if you're going to have enough Orthodox Christians in America to have some state in America secede off and become independent. That might be a problem. But where we are now, we're not on that level yet. As Western Orthodox Christians who don't, for instance, live in Greece or in Romania or wherever, we're far too small, and we need to focus on the basics first. But then flip side, in places like Romania, that claims to be an Orthodox nation, there I think the Orthodox people who are genuinely Orthodox need to also focus more on that and become more active in that, and not just be people who are Orthodox in their confession, but not in the way they live.
Yeah.
So it's that two sides of the coin.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, both I've been watching obviously Father Spiridon, Father Josiah Trenum, and both of them recently talked about focusing too much on the externals. And now I, as a young Western guy, I converted to Orthodoxy, and the first thing I was like, retake Constantinople! Honestly, try to be a good Christian first before you worry about anything like that.